this is some of these slides are literally from the beginning one. I'm just gonna very quickly run through them. Reminder, people learn by doing things. I think we both have intuitive experience of that, and tens of thousands of research papers that show that, from tightly controlled psychology experiments to more classroom-based things. And the reasons being, when we explain things, it helps us learn. Folks are probably know the idea of the best way to learn something, or a great way to learn it, is to teach it, because we have to learn how to explain it. We get feedback, and we can see ourselves in the discipline when we participate. And also, inequities are everywhere. So I'm kind of running through those. And so, as I said in the earlier session, the approach that I've taken is really not to have, while there's value in broader conversations around equity, really our focus is on concrete practices and data, because we find that talking about things tends to not really change anything. And so I guess the flip side of our sessions here, is that these are like the trailer, right? Because if you go to the sessions but don't do anything afterwards, then they're not really helpful. But hopefully it uses it as a starting point to consider trying practices from the book, or maybe if Eric gets it off the ground, building some learning communities with data, right? So this is the invitation, but the learning doesn't really happen until you really dive deep into the practice and you need the time on task, right? I think we know that's part of developing expertise. So the type of data that we've been developing, we have this principle called social marker specificity, and this is the idea that inequities in our society are grounded. I think it was Mark who said this very well, are grounded in our specific social marker identities, be race, class, gender, disability, sexuality, and so forth. And so if we want to address those in the classroom, we need to pay attention to those. And it turns out in the fields of education research, or discipline-based education research, there are literally hundreds of tools out there that observe classrooms. And when we started working on this tool 10 years ago, there was almost nothing that disaggregated. And honestly, today, 10 years later, very few tools look at the classroom this way. So if you don't have that same assumption, then you probably won't like this tool. But we found that as an operating assumption, attending to social marker identities is a very effective way for us to both identify and reduce inequities in our classrooms. And you see that in institutional data, right? We can look at disparities based on race and other things, and it's very clear in the data. So here's the tool, Equip. I dropped the link in the chat. I'm going to give you all a chance to sign up and log in for that. So if you were here for part one and you just want to just hop over to that website now, you can even start creating yourself an account, as you're not getting too bored by me going through some of these same slides again. Otherwise, hang on, it's a wild ride. Here we go. But basically, the way that we've developed this is that we frame the equity questions in terms of social markers. So we ask things about what's happening for different groups of students. And that's not the only way we look at it. We also look at individual students, but we have to be asking these questions, or we're sort of missing the ways that the societal inequities play out in the classroom. And the way that we capture that is fully customizable. And so that's part of what makes a tool developed by a bunch of math people apply across disciplines, because you can basically slot in whatever facets of classroom practice or whatever demographics are relevant to either your discipline or your context, right? And so we've had folks as far ranging as applying this to equity in a music class. If you can wrap your head around what does that really mean? And it's a very different question than a math class. These are just some screenshots from the app, which we'll dive into in a second anyway. But basically, we set up a classroom, we observe, or we code some classroom practice. That could be a person sitting in a classroom coding as they're observing. That could be someone video recording their classroom and then coding it later. And a lot of times when we've been coaching folks, we're having instructors record their video and then upload that to the research team, and then we're coding that to give them data. And then we're generating data. And so you can see some samples of the data analytics on the bottom. I think the key part that I can't overemphasize is that most of the data that we get from the institution or even our assessments tends to be after the fact, right? We get equity gaps in student grades and stuff like that, which is useful in some ways for noticing patterns, but it's also kind of late. If you see that half of, of certain students from a group of students failed your class, it would be wonderful to intervene before they failed the class rather than measuring that when it's too late to change it. So we're trying to get in progress data as the classroom goes, as the semester goes by, that we can actually give back to instructors to revise their practices as they're going. And so for those of you in the first half, or those of you who watched the second half later, that's exactly what we saw Dr. Adams doing with the gender inequities in her class. And turns out with data and support, she was actually able to make a really big change in her classroom. So, okay, great. So yeah, so here's the Equip tour. So I first want to just get folks to literally, it's totally free to sign up, but I think being able to look at it from your own machine is a good way to start. So that's in the chat. Feel free to just like sign up for an account. You can just it'll ask you like 3 things about your email or whatever you need to do. It's free, and that'll let you play around with it in a more effectively. I'll just pause for a minute so folks can do that. And then I'll probably share my screen and walk through it, but then you can kind of follow along on your own. And you might have questions as you're going to. This is going to be the most exciting part of the recording if people come back and watch it later.
I totally should pause it.
Okay, great. So I'm going to share my screen. So if you're logged in, well, so here, I can actually, I'll run it through the kind of from start. So you'll get a particular type of page when you pull this up. And then if you log in, that's my password, or incorrectly type my password. Not a very fun part. So I'm logging in. It's almost the same, but it's slightly different. The menus on top change. And so sort of one of the first places that you might look if you're new, we have this tutorials page, and there's basically videos that are going to walk you through how to use different pieces of the app, from setting up your classroom, observing how to use the different data analytics. Now, some of the analytics ones are slightly older, so there's a couple new features that aren't on there, but it's still going to give you the basic idea of how everything works. The main area here, look at these great classrooms, test classroom, example classroom, is the dashboard. And so the dashboard is basically where you're setting up classrooms. And so the way that it works in the app is you can have any number of classrooms that you want to use. Let's say you were coding yourself, you'd create a classroom for yourself. You could say create a new classroom. Type in the name, it's going to come up, and basically you're going to get like one of these little black bars for that. And the things that you'll have to do is basically there's 3 parts to it. You're going to set up your demographics. And so this could be, so the demographics are complicated, right? Because these are all socially constructed. There's not like a right version of social markers. And so you pick which ones you want to look at in your classroom. And then you also have to pick the levels that you want to look at for them, right? Because, here's a set of racial and ethnic identities that is one variation, but in your local context, that might not actually make sense, right? For example, you might have different populations of Asian American students that you want to distinguish. So you have to really think about who is in your classroom when you're developing the data to generate meaningful data. We try to do like 3 to 5 levels per social marker category, because if you cut the data too many ways, then we're going to have like groups of 1 to 2 students, unless you have a really big class. Discourse dimensions, and I can share coding resources for those who are interested too. These are basically the types of things that we're coding when a student contributes, and we're going to code some nature about what they say, how much they say, what kinds of questions teachers ask, and things like that. And then the last one is just sort of setting up the student roster. Who are the students? This is basically who are the students and what are their demographics. And so in K-12 schools, often the data just exists. I know on a lot of campuses, institutional research can be challenging to get data from. So typically the way that we'll do it is we give surveys to students in the classes to fill them out. It's helpful to just give class time to do that if folks want to do it. And then the alternative is sort of asking faculty members. We can get sort of gut impressions, which is not necessarily accurately reflect every group that students identify with, but it reflects our own biases and perceptions. So it's still useful. And sort of an underlying philosophy with Equip is that all observations are imperfect. We're not aiming for like 100% perfection. We're trying to get a general sense of what is happening in a way that is consequential for teaching. Because most of the times what we'll observe is we'll go into a classroom and it's like 3 students talk and they take up 95% of the talk time. And like, even if we weren't 100% accurate on that, the pattern is so broad and so obvious that having the data already allows that for us. So then the last piece that we're going to do inside the classroom is setting up the observations. And so here is basically essentially some version of a type of a seating chart. Now, if you had 100 students in there, it's going to be kind of not ideal. I think we can talk about ways to use this in a large classroom, but typically we typically work with like 40 or less students in the class. And we just click on a name and we can basically code some aspect of their contribution. And then we'll get a running log of what happened. But more importantly, once we've coded that, we can use the data analytics. And so there's a bunch of different views here. I can walk you through a couple of them. And the idea being here, right, the patterns that happen in the classroom. Honestly, I've worked with a lot of instructors, and everyone that I've worked with has been a little bit surprised when they actually see their data. They have an idea of what they think it looks like, and then there's the reality of what the data actually looks like, and rarely are those exactly the same, right? Because we're so busy as instructors, we just can't track these things, and we don't track them accurately. So I could pull this up. And so with these little timelines here, what you can actually do is select which observations you want to include in the data analytics. So we can either aggregate over time or look at like a specific observation if we're working in over time. And so here is sort of contributions in the classroom broken down by gender. So we can see both individual students that are participating and the distribution across those groups. We could pick any social marker identity that we wanted to. So here's by racial and ethnic identities and so forth. So that's one analytic. You'll notice in most of the analytics, we have both like a group level and an individual component, because we know there's the group aspect of the inequities, but then also variation for individual students, right? So we want to capture both of those. We can do gender here. So this is like a heat map. So we can see data similarly broken down, visualized slightly differently, but on this graph, we can also filter Let's say we want to only look at the lower income students in the course. Maybe they're receiving financial aid. And so then it's going to highlight just those ones for us to compare across the groups. We can do something like that. We can also do, let's say, a timeline, right? So I want to look at how have things changed over time. So by gender, the type of student talk, and explanations, how often students get to explain their thinking. So I can see from one observation to the next how that's changed. So I want to pause. That's a lot of information, but that's just sort of a general overview of the app and how it works. And typically, if we're coding, let's say we wanted to code, I don't know, maybe have 20 minutes of discussion in a class session, it would probably take 30 to 40 minutes to code that. So it's not a long, it's not no time, but it's not significantly more than the time of the class time that actually took place. Okay, so Jody has a question about seating chart. I mean, no, it's not really, it doesn't really matter. You can just click on the student anywhere they are. So honestly, you could just arrange the names alphabetically if you wanted to for the desks.
Dan, what is the largest group if you've used this with?
Probably the largest that we've done is around 50 in a class. I mean, I've gotten this question so many times, and part of the issue is, as folks who do research methodologies know, just the project of developing a methodology is a lot of work. And then you need people to use the methodology to expand the research. And so that is happening. But I'm sort of just waiting for the right person. Maybe the right person is on this very call to apply this to a large lecture course, right? And I think it could be done, and there's actually different ways to do that. One idea is to sort of sample some segment of the course, right? Maybe I want to focus on these 3 rows of students and just see what happens for them in terms of patterns. I mean, you could do the whole class too. Really, the key thing that would be needed is that you need to identify the students who are participating. So that would require, it actually would just require intentional use of student names. That's all you would really need, or name tents or something like that. But it's definitely doable in a large lecture. So Erica, you could find the person to do that, and then I will tell them, look, I know these folks who have done it, but I haven't personally done it. I don't usually teach large lecture courses. In terms of validity, so the short answer is it depends. And it depends on the purposes. So we have a much longer analysis. I can actually dig up the link to that article where we looked at this. I mean, broadly, if you look at research observation tools to really like hit the levels of reliability that you want, you start to do like 6 to 10 observations for very rigorous research purposes. And that's not specific to this tool, that's specific to in general. But when your purpose is not to build a hierarchical linear model with fidelity, but rather to support instructor learning, what we find is based on experience, having 4 observations in a semester is phenomenal. So that's basically 1 per month, because that's enough for people to see progress and enough conversations where people can actually like notice their change and do changes. So I can actually look for that article, and maybe I can even drop it in the chat if you want to get way more into that. But I mean, I guess one other element of that is this tool is actually very low inference, right? We're sort of counting things that happen in the classroom. It's actually a bit easier to get iterator reliability and things like that, as opposed to rubric-based tools that have a lot more level of inference in them.
And I suppose it also matters, like, what are you using the data for? If you're using it for your own personal reflection, then I wouldn't worry so much about how many observations I need. It's just something that I'm going to use as a reflective teacher. But if I were going to try and publish it, or if I was going to try and document it in a more systematic way for scholarship of teaching and learning, then I might worry more. But I think for most of us, it would be just a cool tool, especially those of us that are in Lyft. It would be a really cool tool to use during our classroom observations.
Yeah. And honestly, Erica, I feel like so often research gets published without even using that many observations. It just gets published anyway, which we can debate around that. But yeah, I'm gonna drop a link to a really nice article from Sandra Larson where they I think this is the right one. I have to see. They took on this question, and it's actually a really useful one. So I guess the question, so we have 15 minutes, and so if it would be helpful to folks, a question is, would people like to look at a little bit of video to see sort of what a coding process could look like? Would that be helpful?
I have a question regarding the logistics of, using this tool and recording your classroom, like in your institution, like what kind of things you have to account for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you mean in terms of sort of privacy and things like that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, so for research purposes, everything that we're doing is with an institutional review board, right, to publish that. I think it turns out for the most part, institutions actually have broad ability to collect data for the purposes of instructional improvement. There's quite a lot of leeway that it comes. Now, individual institutions might be different, but typically the way that we do it is, and this is what IRB has also approved across many sites, is that we have an opportunity to opt out. So we give an information sheet to the students. If they don't want to be recorded, they don't want their data to be used, they sign it and they opt out. Our experience has been that very, very few students choose to do that. Maybe that's surprising, but when we have an instructor basically frame this as, my goal is to be a better instructor for you and to learn how to really support all of my students, and that's why I'm collecting these data, students don't tend to say no. I think in a classroom, usually the mean would be like one student opts out. And for those students, we just seat them in a way where we try to keep them off of the camera. But we've never, I know it feels like it should be a really big issue, but it hasn't been an issue for us in a lot of settings. It just, students tend to be fine with it.
I have other question regarding the Hawthorne effects. Like, do you feel like the students behave in a different way when they are recorded versus like on a regular class when they are not recorded? And how do you overcome that?
It's such a good question, and it turns out not really. And I learned this in such a kind of maybe a sad way, but and I know ideas about Hawthorne effects and these things were very big in psychology like 30, 40 years ago. But there was a study we did in a geometry classroom, and we had the videos running, and it was all group work. And I was just baffled by the things. There were a couple of men in the classroom would just say the most outright, blatantly sexist things right in front of the camera, like things that you would feel like you would be embarrassed to say if you knew someone was watching you. And they just went on and did all of this as if it didn't even matter. And so our experience has really been that, sometimes in a first observation, especially with kids, like middle schoolers will make a funny face in the camera and stuff. But then once they get it out, like, then it's just, they forget about it. So I don't think it tends to make a big difference. Yeah, maybe Molly, and then maybe we can look at a video super quick.
I just had a question because I was the one that brought up larger groups.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and maybe I don't know if this tool would work for this, but it just has my brain thinking, because one of the things in advertising in these large lecture classes, we have a lot of students with accommodations, with things like ADHD, they're very creative minds. And
Yeah.
one of my concerns is these big lecture classes actually turn students off,
Yeah.
and they would be excellent in the profession. They just need to get through these like initial classes, and part of that is our department figuring out how to do that better. And the other part is learning just how to teach it in a way that recognizes those students. So those aren't really gender markers. Those aren't, and I know accommodations get into a whole nother thing. But I wonder if that's anything that this model has addressed with like Gen Z and attention span in courses or
Yeah.
anything like that.
Yeah, that's great. So also, I actually have a doctoral student who is actually about to defend in a month. And her entire dissertation was sort of oriented around doing this with disabled students in higher education and teaching faculty around accessible teaching and things like that. So her basically that entire dissertation takes on that focus. And then there's other work I've been doing that's not published yet, but we've done a lot with a colleague we're looking in a mix of sort of special education and inclusive math classrooms in elementary schools. And so those are environments where you see all kinds of things happening, right? Because kids, they don't know how to sit in a chair for 5 hours. And frankly, they probably shouldn't sit in a chair for 5 hours. And so again, we can look at multimodality, but really those are things that could be just in a survey to the students, right? A demographic survey, we can ask. And I think, again, if things are framed in the right way and things are asked in a sensitive way, we've found that students tend to be pretty forthcoming and want to be supported. So my belief is that you could actually operate, it would take a little bit more work, but you could use this in a large lecture course. You just need to be very intentional about making sure that someone looking at the video can actually know which students are participating. That's sort of the one barrier, but it's doable. And then when you do it, thank you, Molly, then I will tell other people that this has been done. So let me share, I want to make sure I can at least quickly walk through this example. And I know learning an observation protocol takes time. It's not something that you do in 5 minutes, but I just want to give you a little bit of a sense of what that could look like. So this is actually a graduate level course in abstract algebra. So I don't even think I understand all of the content. I'm not an algebraist in this course, but again, the content here doesn't really matter. Shout out for the math folks. But I don't even remember, they're working with some kind of power series at the moment in this example, but I just wanted to show you a little bit how we segment and code things, and you'll get a sense. So don't really worry about the math here.
Right, t plus 1 monomials of each degree, right? If I stick a 2 up here, not a trick question, where does that 2 go on the right? Inside. Goes inside here, right? That doubles everything. So if we put a 2 here, we get a 2 right there. That would give us an 11 right here, right? So how do I handle the fact that I want that to be a 10? I've got 1 more than I want in each graded degree. I'm 1 too many in each graded degree. What do I need to do? Right, because I'm not just 1 off here, I'm 1 off in every single term. I need to subtract a 1, a z squared, a z cubed, etc. What needs to go in the space? I don't have nearly enough space to write in here. I'm off by exactly 1. I'm over by exactly 1 for each value of t. Minus what? 1. Close. So okay. So what would minus 1 do? How many of the coefficients? We got this.
So you're trying to subtract another power series?
Yes. Yes. Right. Subtracting.
Okay. So great. Math. I love math. It's wonderful. I mean that in the most sincere way as well. It is wonderful. But if you're not a math person, that's okay, because that's not really what I want to focus on here. Other than the context within which we were doing this, right? It was a graduate level math course, working with this instructor. And so here you can see, this is a slightly abridged version of the transcript, because we cut out some of the teacher talk, because typically we're not coding a lot of the teacher talk. But so you can see there's sort of back and forth between the teacher and a couple of students. And I want to just look at how we segment this. And so basically the way that we code is every time there's a new student that's participating, we code that as a new contribution. So like here in the beginning, there's a little bit of Rachel has like a couple contributions here. It's just the teacher and Rachel. We're sort of chunking that all together. So for us, this would be a total of 3 things that we code. One with Rachel, then Scott, and then Rachel again, because there's sort of the between the two of them. And so that's just the segmentation piece. And that's not the only way to do it. That's just methodologically the way we've chosen to do it, to allow for things like teacher back and forth and teacher press. So you can see here in this particular, and these slides were put together by one of my students who was coding it. So the first thing that we're looking at on there is called solicitation method. This is whether, you know, the teacher was asking for hands to be raised, whether students were just shouting things out. And you could see in the video, Rachel just blurts out the answer. It's gonna be inside. And Rachel's just saying a few words. We have this spectrum from like why, how, what, and other. And so like with the why talk, we're looking at our students, you know, explaining an idea, or in a math class, are they justifying or doing something with a proof that has like sort of a logical, rigorous basis to it? Or is it just sort of like, in this case, she's just giving the answer, right? I think it's inside. There's no justification. So that's, we code that as a what. And so in here, as the teacher is asking, like, what do I need to do? What's the step of the process? We're coding that as a how statement. And then we have this evaluation where the teacher says whether it's right or wrong. So that's a really fast way to go through it. And this is just one set of codes. You could actually develop your own, but we can work through another thing. Okay, we can look at Scott's example. You know, he's got a question. We code that as an other statement because he's not giving a math idea. He's asking a question, and so forth. And so that's basically what it looks like in the app. Is we're just literally tapping those buttons. That's the quickest overview you could have ever imagined of the coding process. But for folks who actually think that that is interesting or could be useful, or something that you want to do, we have a lot more resources. But that's just to give you kind of a sense of how it works. It's very low level. It's very low inference. We're not trying to make statements that really about what's good or bad, or to judge the classroom. We're just trying to generate data about it, and then draw our own conclusions based on whatever commitments we might have.
Have you, this might be a weird question, but like, have undergraduates ever used it to like self-regulate? I mean, I think the first time I heard this, I was like, I want to use this in faculty meeting because I want to see if I'm talking too much, right? Because I talk a lot. Have people used it in that way?
You know, I haven't tried to get faculty members to agree to let me observe their faculty meeting. That could be contentious, but I mean, the interesting thing is basically since I've been developing this tool for 10 years now, when I'm in a faculty meeting, when I'm at a conference, when I'm watching a political debate on TV, right? It's so internalized. I'm kind of doing just a coding in my head. It is, yes, Erica, it is exactly what you think it would be. And the numbers probably back up that certain groups of people tend to dominate those conversations. And often it tends to be not everyone, but specific individuals within those groups tend to disproportionately take up time and space.
No, I wonder if students, if they knew about it, if they would find it useful to use and think, oh, wow, I don't like how this environment is. I'm going to change it somehow, right?
I had a counseling faculty member that we worked with. She did share some of the data with her students who were, I guess they were master's students. There's also a school, we didn't do this, but there was a school that basically found the tool and was like, we're going to work with this. And it was a first or a second grade teacher who was like doing like computer science stuff. with her students. And so she was collecting the data, generating the data, and then sharing it with the students and saying like, what do you think is fair? Let's have conversations around fairness. And so rather than big data, she called it baby data because it was with like 6-year-olds. So they did the baby data version where they would like talk about the data together. So I think it's not something that we've done a lot. I think, I think it does need to be done with a little bit of care, right? That could be a vulnerable conversation with students. But I think it's certainly there are ways to bring it into the classroom and actually sharing the data with the students. It hasn't been something we've done a lot of, but we do have some kind of like little examples of people doing that kind of thing. Like I said, you could be the next one.
I feel so empowered to go be, a trendsetter, Dan, after hearing you. I can be the next one to do a lot of things.
Exactly. Yeah, advertising, right?
I'm glad somebody believes in us.
I do. But it has been fun, yeah. We've been doing this long enough to see people take it up across contexts. I mean, there's a few thousand users, so it's not like a taking over the world, but enough that, we're learning what it looks like in different contexts, and we're learning the commonalities, and we're learning new ideas from people. So it's always really fun to learn those things.
I think it would be fascinating. Of course, this is the research side, but so I work with a program, and many of the folks on this call have either been through it or going to go through it, and it's called LIFT, and it's a year-long faculty development program, and a lot of what we're focusing on is student affect, right? We're trying to encourage greater senses of belonging and connection, growth mindset, self-compassion, these sorts of things. And, we do that by using clever and stealthy active learning pedagogies that align well with our content. This could be actually, I don't know how you would do it because it's a college classroom, but I could imagine somebody who's been through LIFT probably has students who are speaking up more often than they would in non-LIFT classrooms. And it would be really interesting to follow our students in that way through their different courses, especially if it's within a major, to see where they're finding their voice and when they're not.
Yeah. I mean, it's a big research study, but methodologically, you could do it, right? If you had the resources and you were to analyze the classroom practice, you could actually track those things. Or even just to track, program evaluation, right? Have folks before they join the program kind of analyze some of their teaching and then analyze it after they've been through it. Adding the data, we tend to notice a very big shift when people have access to the data. And that was part one, but that's the other book that I'm working on right now. So I'll send it to you in a year and a half or something.
We'll be ready for it.
Right. Well, hopefully you'll tell me all the things that you learned in large lecture advertising and in giving data back to your students and all these other fun things to do.
Any other questions, comments, thoughts? I know I build this as going to 2:15 if we needed it to, but I also know that you are stuck in grading caves and you might want to crawl back into. I wish I would have more carefully looked at this tool earlier this year. It would have been very helpful for some work that I was doing with the LIFT group. So Molly, watch out. This will probably show up this coming year. You too, Mark.
I could see some cool ramifications, Daniel, when you think about, I know advertising seems out there, but it's actually not when you think about media literacy and what's going on with social media and understanding kind of the ethics and who's at the table creating creative content. And the big picture, that's something I have an interest in that has nothing to do with really what I teach, but just kind of the big picture. But anyway, just something to think about as you develop and as as I do lift and watch cool things occur.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. That'd be, I mean, I always love to hear back from folks. So I'll drop my email in there, but I'm sure Erica will bother me if other things come up. But always, yeah, I always love to hear from folks as what you're playing around with and what you're doing.
Awesome. Thanks for coming, Emily.
Yeah, and thank you for everyone
Daniel.
taking the time hanging out. I appreciate you all spending the time.
You bet.
You too, Casey. Thanks. I think you might be a partner in crime with my brother. I'm not sure if that's true, but we
Yes,
should.
that is true.
He says good things about you.
Aw, that's nice to hear. Yes, definitely working with him has been a highlight of my year. So